Some men believe money opens every door, the old bartender liked to say. But once in a while, a door stays closed. And that's when a man finally learns who he really is. On a cool Thursday evening in downtown Chicago, the rain tapped softly against the tall windows of Marlowe House, a restaurant known for its quiet elegance and white tablecloths that seemed too perfect to touch. The room glowed with warm amber light. Crystal glasses chimed gently as executives discussed deals worth more than most people's homes. And moving through the room with calm precision was Clara Bennett, a waitress most guests barely noticed. Clara was 28 years old, with chestnut hair pulled neatly into a low bun and a posture that suggested patience rather than submission. She walked lightly between tables, carrying trays with steady hands, her expression professional but distant, as if the noise of wealth around her belonged to another world entirely. Some waitresses laughed easily with customers. Some tried to charm their way into larger tips. Clara did neither. She served with quiet efficiency, placed every glass exactly where it belonged, and moved on without lingering. To most diners, she was simply part of the background, another uniform, another polite smile in a busy restaurant. But to one man sitting near the center of the room, she was something else entirely. Alexander Pierce rarely went unnoticed. At 39, he was the founder of Pierce Capital, a hedge fund that controlled billions in assets and influenced companies across the country. His tailored navy suit probably cost more than a month's rent for many people in the city, and the Swiss watch on his wrist reflected the warm light of the dining room every time he checked the time. People in rooms like this usually knew who he was. Some greeted him eagerly. Others spoke more carefully when he was nearby. Wealth had a way of changing the temperature of a room. But Clara Bennett had been serving Alexander's table for nearly 3 weeks now, and if she recognized him, she never showed it. The first time he noticed her was simple curiosity. She didn't hover around his table the way some servers did when they recognized a wealthy guest. She didn't mention his company, didn't compliment his watch, didn't ask the usual polite questions meant to start a conversation. She simply delivered the coffee he ordered, nodded once, and walked away. The second time he noticed her was something closer to intrigue. Alexander had spent most of his life around people who wanted something from him. Investors wanted access. Partners wanted influence. Strangers wanted opportunity. But Clara moved through the restaurant as if none of that mattered. She treated the retired couple in booth 7 with the same calm attention she gave the table where venture capitalists were discussing a $400 million merger. Equal. Professional. Unimpressed. By the third week, Alexander realized something unusual had happened. He was watching her. Not constantly. Not obviously. But often enough to notice the details. The way she balanced 3 plates on one arm without rushing. The way she listened when elderly guests spoke slowly. The way she quietly corrected an order mistake before the customer even realized it had happened. There was something deliberate about her movements. Careful. Thoughtful. Almost disciplined. It wasn't the behavior he expected from someone working late shifts in a downtown restaurant. Tonight, the rain outside had driven more people indoors, filling the restaurant with conversation and the warm scent of grilled steak and fresh bread. Alexander sat alone at his usual table, a cup of black coffee resting near his hand. Across the room, Clara finished placing a dessert plate in front of another table before turning toward the service station. For a moment, she paused to adjust the sleeve of her uniform, her expression calm and unreadable. Alexander studied her quietly. Most people in his world competed for attention. Clara seemed perfectly comfortable without it. And that, more than anything else, made him curious. The rain outside grew steadier as the evening moved forward, tracing slow lines down the tall windows of Marlowe House. Inside, the restaurant hummed with the quiet rhythm of polished silverware and careful conversation. Clara Bennett continued her work the same way she always did, calm, steady, almost invisible to those who were too busy watching their phones or discussing quarterly profits. She carried a tray of glasses to table 12, placed them carefully beside each setting, and offered a polite smile before moving on. Across the room, Alexander Pierce watched her again without realizing how often he had begun to do it. It was not fascination in the usual sense. Alexander had met models, entrepreneurs, celebrities, and executives who tried very hard to be noticed. Clara was different because she seemed completely uninterested in being noticed at all. That alone made her unusual in a place like this. He took a sip of his coffee, now lukewarm, while his mind wandered back to a conversation he had heard earlier that evening. Two young analysts from a financial firm had been sitting at the table beside him. They had spent nearly 20 minutes arguing about market projections, using complicated language that sounded impressive but lacked any real conviction. Alexander had seen that kind of performance many times before. People often mistook complexity for intelligence. During that conversation, Clara had quietly refilled their water glasses without interrupting. She had stood there only a few seconds, listening politely before returning to the kitchen. Yet something about her expression had stayed with him. It was not judgment. It was something closer to quiet amusement, as if she had heard that type of conversation many times before. Alexander placed his cup down and glanced toward the service station again. Clara was speaking briefly with the bartender, her voice low and calm. A moment later, she picked up another tray and walked toward a corner table where an elderly man sat alone. The man looked at least 70 years old, his shoulders slightly hunched as he studied the menu through thick reading glasses. Clara did not rush him. She leaned slightly closer, pointing to a few items on the menu while speaking slowly, giving him time to decide. Alexander could not hear the conversation, but he could see the man relax almost immediately. A small smile appeared on his face before he finally nodded and handed the menu back. Clara returned the smile gently and wrote down the order. There was patience in the way she handled the moment, something rare in a city that moved as quickly as Chicago. Alexander leaned back in his chair, studying the room. Most people believed success meant controlling every situation, bending the world slightly in their direction. He had built an entire career on that idea. But watching Clara move through the restaurant, he sensed a different kind of control. She did not command attention. She did not demand respect. Yet somehow, the space around her felt steady when she was present, as if the noise of the restaurant softened just a little. A few minutes later, she approached his table again, carrying a small silver coffee pot. Without asking, she gently refilled his cup and placed the pot beside him in case he wanted more. Her movements were precise, but unhurried. When she finished, she gave a brief nod. "Is there anything else you need tonight, Mr. Pierce?" Her voice was calm, professional, and completely neutral. Alexander looked up at her, slightly surprised. Most staff avoided using his name unless he introduced himself. He studied her expression for a moment, searching for curiosity or recognition. But Clara simply waited, composed and patient, as if speaking to a billionaire was no different from speaking to any other guest in the room. Alexander Pierce held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. It was a habit he had developed over the years, studying people carefully before speaking, measuring confidence the way an investor measured risk. Yet Clara Bennett did not shift under the attention. She simply waited, standing beside the table with quiet patience, the silver coffee pot still resting lightly in her hand. "No," Alexander finally said, his voice calm. "The coffee is perfect." Clara gave a small nod, as if the answer had been exactly what she expected. "If you need anything else, I will be nearby." She turned smoothly and stepped away, already focused on another table across the room. Alexander watched her walk toward the couple near the window, where a young man in a gray jacket was attempting to decide between two entrees, while his companion laughed softly. Clara listened to them for a moment, offering a quiet suggestion before writing down the order. The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds, yet both guests seemed noticeably more relaxed afterward. Alexander leaned back in his chair again. In the financial world, people were often eager to impress him. They talked quickly, filled the air with confident predictions, and tried to prove they were worth his attention. Clara did none of those things. If anything, she seemed entirely comfortable giving attention rather than seeking it. He glanced down at his watch. The evening had already stretched longer than he planned. His schedule for the following morning included a conference call at 8 o'clock, followed by a meeting with investors arriving from New York. Normally, he would have finished dinner and left by now. Instead, he found himself sitting quietly, observing a waitress who seemed unaware that she had become the most interesting part of his evening. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming softly against the glass. A flash of lightning briefly illuminated the street beyond the restaurant windows, followed by a low rumble of thunder that rolled through the city. Several diners glanced toward the storm before returning to their meals. Inside Marlowe House, the lighting remained warm and steady, as if the weather belonged to another world entirely. Clara returned to the service station to pick up another tray. As she lifted it, one of the younger servers approached her with a worried expression. The young man spoke quickly, pointing toward a table where two business clients appeared to be discussing a billing mistake. Clara listened without interrupting. She nodded once, then walked calmly toward the table. Alexander watched the interaction from across the room. One of the clients was clearly frustrated, his voice slightly louder than the surrounding conversations. The manager had not yet arrived, but Clara stepped beside the table and spoke quietly to the man. She did not rush. She did not appear defensive. She simply listened for a moment, then said something that caused the tension to soften almost immediately. The man leaned back in his chair, the frustration fading from his expression. Within another minute, the conversation ended with a polite handshake and a relieved smile from the other guest. Clara returned to the service station as if nothing unusual had happened. Alexander studied the scene carefully. Negotiations were a familiar part of his life. In boardrooms, disagreements often lasted hours and required teams of lawyers to resolve. Yet Clara had just settled a conflict in less than 2 minutes with nothing more than patience and careful words. That was not a common skill. He looked toward her again as she organized a stack of menus near the counter. For the first time that evening, Alexander felt a genuine curiosity forming, the kind that had guided many of his most successful investments. It was the quiet recognition that something valuable might be hidden beneath the surface. And in that moment, he realized he wanted to understand Clara Bennett. Alexander Pierce remained seated long after the small conflict across the room had faded into ordinary conversation. The restaurant continued its quiet rhythm around him, glasses clinking softly, low laughter drifting from nearby tables, the storm outside pressing against the tall windows like a distant reminder of another world. Yet, his attention kept returning to the same place near the service station where Clara Bennett organized menus and checked orders with calm efficiency. It was not only what she did that caught his interest, it was how she did it. In Alexander's world, problems were usually met with pressure. People raised their voices, defended their positions, pushed harder until the other side finally gave in. That approach had built entire empires. But Clara seemed to operate by a different set of rules. She listened first. She moved slowly enough for others to feel heard. And somehow that quiet patience solved conflicts faster than force ever could. Alexander rested his hand against the side of his coffee cup, now warm again after her refill. The idea forming in his mind felt unfamiliar. Curiosity was normal in business, but this was something more personal. He wanted to see how she would respond if the conversation shifted toward her instead of the menu. A few minutes later, Clara approached his table again, this time carrying a small dessert tray for the couple seated behind him. She placed the plates carefully, answered a brief question about the chocolate tart, and turned to leave. As she passed his table, Alexander spoke before the moment could disappear. "Miss Bennett." Clara paused and turned back toward him, her expression calm but attentive. "Yes, Mr. Pierce." The way she said his name carried no excitement and no hesitation, only simple recognition. Alexander gestured lightly toward the empty chair across from him. "May I ask you something that is not about coffee or dinner?" Clara studied him for a brief moment. Not suspicious, not impressed, just thoughtful. "You may ask," she replied. "Whether I answer is another matter." The corner of Alexander's mouth lifted slightly in surprise. It had been a long time since someone had answered him that way. Most people rushed to agree before he even finished speaking. He folded his hands together on the table. "Fair enough." Clara waited quietly. The restaurant noise continued around them, yet the space between them felt strangely still. "You seem unusually calm for someone working in a place like this," Alexander said. "Most people here are either rushed or trying to impress someone." Clara considered the question before answering. "People often reveal more about themselves when they are not being rushed," she said. "It makes the job easier." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "You mean the job of serving dinner?" Clara gave a faint smile, one that suggested the answer was more complex than the words themselves. "People are usually not only hungry for food," she said. "Sometimes they are hungry for patience." Alexander leaned back slightly in his chair. That was not the kind of answer he expected from a waitress during a dinner shift. Yet it sounded sincere. "You speak as if you study people," he said. Clara tilted her head slightly. "Everyone studies people," she replied. "Some just pretend they do not." For the first time that evening, Alexander let out a quiet laugh. It was brief, but genuine. Across the room, a few diners glanced in their direction, curious about the unexpected sound. Clara remained composed, though the faint smile still lingered on her face. Alexander studied her carefully now. The curiosity he felt earlier had grown into something clearer. Clara Bennett was not only different. She was deliberate. And the more he listened, the more he realized that this quiet waitress might be far more interesting than anyone else in the room. Alexander Pierce rested his elbows lightly on the edge of the table, studying Clara Bennett with the same careful attention he once used when evaluating a promising company. The restaurant continued moving around them in quiet waves of conversation, but the space between them remained calm, almost insulated from the rest of the room. Clara did not appear uncomfortable with the silence. She simply stood beside the table, hands gently folded in front of her apron, waiting as if patience itself were part of her routine. Alexander finally spoke again. "You are not what I expected when I first sat down tonight," he said. Clara tilted her head slightly. "Most expectations are built quickly," she replied. "Reality usually takes longer." Alexander smiled faintly at that answer. It was measured, thoughtful, and delivered without the slightest hint of trying to impress him. "You speak like someone who has spent time thinking about people," he said. Clara glanced briefly toward the service station where another server was arranging fresh glasses for the next guests. "Working in a restaurant is a good place to observe," she said. "You see celebrations, business deals, apologies, first dates, last conversations. People forget that someone is always listening." Alexander followed her gaze for a moment before returning his attention to her face. "And what have you learned from all that observation?" he asked. Clara paused, as if choosing her words carefully. "That wealth makes people louder," she said calmly. "But it does not necessarily make them clearer." The answer landed with unexpected precision. Alexander let out a quiet breath, amused and slightly impressed at the same time. Few people spoke to him with that kind of honesty. Most conversations around him were softened by caution or ambition. Clara showed neither. "You know who I am," he said after a moment. It was not a question. Clara nodded once. "Yes." Alexander leaned forward slightly. "And yet you treat me the same as everyone else." Clara looked at him steadily. "That is the job," she said. "To serve everyone well." Alexander watched her for another moment. There was no hesitation in her tone, no curiosity about his company or his influence, just simple professionalism. That alone was unusual enough to keep his interest. He glanced toward the window where the rain now ran in steady streams down the glass. The storm outside had grown heavier, and the streetlights reflected through the water in long golden lines. When he turned back, Clara was still standing there, patient as before. Alexander made a decision then, the same kind of quick instinct that had guided many of his business moves. "I have a proposal for you," he said. Clara raised one eyebrow slightly. "A proposal usually comes after dessert," she replied. Alexander laughed softly again, shaking his head. "Not that kind of proposal," he said. "A dinner invitation." Clara did not answer immediately. Her expression did not change, but her eyes became a little more thoughtful. "You are already having dinner," she said. "Tomorrow evening," Alexander clarified. "Somewhere quieter. No menus to carry, no trays to balance. Just a conversation." Clara looked at the empty chair across from him, then back at Alexander. Around them, the restaurant continued its calm evening rhythm. Finally she spoke, her voice gentle but clear. "And why would you want that, Mr. Pierce?" Alexander answered honestly. "Because you are the first person in this room who does not seem interested in anything I can buy." Clara held his gaze for a long moment. Then she gave a small, polite smile that revealed nothing about her decision. Clara Bennett did not look surprised by the invitation. She simply studied Alexander Pierce the way someone might study a question whose answer was not obvious. The warm lights of Marlowe House reflected softly across the polished table between them, and for a moment the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade into the background again. Alexander waited. He had made offers before in boardrooms and negotiations where millions of dollars depended on the next sentence. Yet this felt different. There were no contracts here, no leverage, no advantage that could force the outcome he preferred. Only a question hanging quietly in the air. Clara glanced briefly toward the large window where rain continued to stream down the glass in thin silver lines. The storm outside showed no sign of slowing. Inside the restaurant, another table erupted in soft laughter as a group of colleagues finished their dessert. Clara returned her attention to Alexander. "You are certain you want a conversation," she said slowly, "and not simply the novelty of asking someone who said something unexpected." Alexander leaned back slightly, considering the honesty in her words. "I have conversations every day," he said. "Most of them sound the same." Clara tilted her head. "And you think this one will be different?" "I know it will be," Alexander replied. Clara studied his expression carefully, as if measuring whether the confidence behind his words came from habit or sincerity. She had seen men like him before. Powerful, decisive, accustomed to shaping outcomes simply by expecting them. Yet Alexander did not appear impatient. If anything, he seemed curious. That detail mattered more than he realized. Clara rested one hand lightly against the back of the empty chair across from him. "There is something you should understand, Mr. Pierce," she said gently. Alexander nodded. "I am listening." Clara's voice remained calm, but her words carried a quiet certainty. "People often believe that an invitation from someone powerful is an opportunity," she said. "Sometimes it is, but sometimes it is simply another transaction." Alexander did not interrupt. Clara continued. "When people live in rooms where influence solves problems, they begin to assume every door opens the same way." Alexander watched her closely now. "And you think that is what I am doing?" Clara offered a faint smile. "I think you are used to doors opening." The statement was not accusatory. It was simply true. Alexander let out a slow breath, almost amused at the accuracy of it. "That has happened. Once or twice," he admitted. Clara looked toward the service station where another server was quietly polishing glasses for the next guests. When she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful rather than dismissive. "Dinner tomorrow evening would be easy to accept," she said. "It would probably be pleasant. Good restaurant, good conversation, good wine." She paused for a moment before finishing the thought. "But the question is not whether the evening would be pleasant." Alexander leaned forward slightly. "Then what is the question?" Clara met his gaze again, her calm expression unchanged. "The question is whether you would still be interested if I were simply Clara Bennett, not the waitress who caught your attention tonight." Alexander did not answer immediately. The storm outside continued tapping steadily against the glass, and for the first time since he had made the invitation, he realized that her response was not about the dinner at all. It was about something much quieter, something he had not considered before. Alexander Pierce did not answer immediately. Clara Bennett's question settled between them like the quiet pause before a decision that mattered. Around them the restaurant continued its steady rhythm, glasses touching softly, distant conversations rising and falling like waves. Yet for Alexander, the noise of the room had faded again. He looked at Clara carefully, noticing the details he had overlooked earlier in the evening. The calm way she stood without shifting her weight. The steady patience in her expression. She was not challenging him. She was simply asking a question that most people in his world never dared to ask. Outside the tall windows, the rain continued sliding down the glass in slow lines that caught the reflection of the streetlights. Alexander leaned back slightly in his chair and folded his hands together on the table. "If you were simply Clara Bennett," he said slowly, "then the answer would still be yes." Clara did not react immediately. She studied him the same way she had earlier, measuring the tone behind the words rather than the words themselves. "That sounds convincing," she replied gently. "But convincing is not always the same as true." Alexander allowed himself a small smile. "You have a very precise way of answering questions." Clara returned the faint smile. "Precision avoids misunderstandings." Alexander glanced briefly around the restaurant. At a nearby table, two colleagues were discussing real estate numbers while a family near the window shared a quiet celebration over slices of cake. For a moment, he considered how strange this conversation might look from the outside. A billionaire sitting alone with a waitress beside his table, speaking as if neither of them noticed the difference between their worlds. But the difference was there. Clara understood it clearly. That was exactly why she had asked the question. Alexander turned back toward her. "You think my interest is temporary," he said. Clara's answer came without hesitation. "I think curiosity often feels stronger than it really is." Alexander nodded slowly. He had built an entire career on recognizing patterns in human behavior. Markets rose and fell according to predictable forces. Ambition, fear, opportunity. But Clara was describing something less measurable. The quiet impulse that caused people to notice something unusual and then forget it once the moment passed. "You believe tomorrow evening I will return to my usual world," Alexander said. "And this conversation will become a brief story about a waitress who spoke honestly." Clara's expression remained calm. "That happens more often than people expect." Alexander tapped his finger lightly against the table, considering the thought. For the first time that evening, he realized that Clara Bennett had placed the decision entirely back in his hands. She was not rejecting the invitation yet, but she was refusing to accept it for the wrong reason. That distinction mattered more than he expected. He looked up again. "And if I told you that curiosity is exactly where every meaningful conversation begins," he said quietly. Clara considered that for a moment. Then she gave a small nod, acknowledging the point without surrendering her position. "That may be true," she said. "But meaningful conversations also require patience." Alexander raised one eyebrow. "Are you suggesting I should practice patience?" Clara's faint smile returned. "I am suggesting that if someone truly wishes to know another person," she said calmly, "one evening is rarely enough." The answer hung gently in the air between them, neither acceptance nor refusal, but something far more deliberate. Alexander Pierce remained silent for several seconds after Clara Bennett spoke. Her words had not been confrontational, yet they carried the quiet weight of someone who understood exactly what she was doing. The restaurant continued moving around them in soft waves of sound, but Alexander no longer noticed the nearby conversations. He was thinking about something far simpler than business strategy or negotiation. Patience. It was a word he rarely heard directed at him. In his world, speed was usually rewarded. Decisions were made quickly. Opportunities were seized before competitors even noticed them. Yet Clara had just suggested something different. That the most interesting things in life might require time instead of urgency. Alexander studied her again, the calm steadiness in her posture, the way she seemed completely comfortable allowing silence to exist between sentences. Most people rushed to fill silence. Clara seemed to respect it. Finally he spoke. "You believe patience proves intention." Clara nodded slightly. "It often reveals it." Alexander leaned back in his chair, considering the idea. Outside the restaurant, the rain had begun to soften, turning from a steady storm into a quiet drizzle that shimmered under the streetlights. A few diners near the window glanced outside as the thunder faded into the distance. Inside Marlowe House, the evening was beginning to wind down. Plates were cleared away. Coffee cups replaced wine glasses. Yet the conversation between Alexander and Clara felt strangely untouched by time. Alexander rested one hand on the table. "You know," he said calmly, "most people would have accepted the invitation immediately." Clara did not seem surprised. "Most people would see it as an opportunity. And you do not." Clara gave a small, thoughtful shrug. "Opportunities are not always what they appear to be." Alexander watched her carefully. There was no defensiveness in her voice. No attempt to lecture him or prove a point. She was simply protecting something that mattered to her. "What exactly are you protecting?" he asked quietly. Clara did not answer right away. She glanced briefly toward another table where a young couple had just finished their dessert and were sharing the last few bites while laughing softly. After a moment, she returned her attention to Alexander. "Respect," she said simply. The word hung between them with surprising clarity. Alexander repeated it quietly. "Respect." Clara nodded once. "When someone meets a person whose life looks very different from their own," she explained, "it is easy for admiration to become curiosity and curiosity to become attention. But attention is not the same as respect." Alexander listened carefully now. This was not a rehearsed speech. It sounded like a belief she had carried for a long time. Clara continued, her tone calm but certain. "If a man asks a woman to dinner because she interests him in the moment, that is curiosity. If he asks because he respects who she is beyond the moment, that is something else." Alexander looked down briefly at the empty coffee cup in front of him, turning the idea over in his mind. Then he looked back at her. "And you are waiting to see which one this is." Clara gave a faint smile. "I am waiting to see whether the invitation still exists when the moment passes." For the first time that evening, Alexander understood exactly what she meant. The question was not whether he wanted dinner tomorrow night. The question was whether he would still care about Clara Bennett once he walked out of the restaurant and returned to the world that usually occupied his attention. And for a man who had spent his entire life getting immediate answers, the possibility of waiting felt strangely unfamiliar. Alexander Pierce remained seated for a moment longer, letting Clara Bennett's words settle into something deeper than a simple conversation. Respect. The word echoed quietly in his thoughts, not as a challenge, but as a mirror reflecting something he rarely examined. Around them, the restaurant had begun its slow transition toward closing. A few tables had emptied. Chairs were gently adjusted by staff preparing for the final hour of the evening. Outside, the rain had almost completely stopped, leaving the streets glossy beneath the city lights. Clara glanced briefly toward the service station where another server had begun stacking menus for the night. Her shift was clearly nearing its end, yet she had not rushed the conversation once. That detail stayed with Alexander. In his world, time was always measured, negotiated, scheduled down to the minute. But tonight time had stretched quietly between two people who had no reason to impress each other. Alexander finally stood from his chair, straightening his jacket. Clara watched the movement calmly, as if she had expected the moment to arrive eventually. "You are leaving," she said gently. It was not a question. Alexander nodded. Yes. He reached into his wallet and placed payment for the dinner on the table, though his attention remained on her rather than the bill. "You gave me something unusual tonight," he said. Clara tilted her head slightly. "Coffee." Alexander smiled faintly. "Perspective." Clara did not react with surprise. Instead, she seemed quietly satisfied that the conversation had reached exactly the place it needed to reach. Alexander looked toward the large window where the last drops of rain slid slowly down the glass before disappearing. For a moment, he imagined what his usual evening would have looked like if he had never noticed Clara Bennett moving through the restaurant earlier. He would have finished dinner quickly, taken a call from one of his partners, returned home to review financial projections for the morning meeting. Efficient. Predictable. Instead, he had spent nearly an hour speaking with someone who had not asked him for anything. Someone who had questioned his intentions without raising her voice. Someone who valued respect more than opportunity. Alexander turned back toward her. "You asked whether the invitation would still exist after the moment passed," he said quietly. Clara nodded once. Alexander took a small business card from his wallet and placed it beside the coffee cup on the table. He did not slide it toward her or offer it directly. He simply left it there. "Tomorrow evening," he said calmly, "I will be having dinner at a small restaurant on Oak Street at 7 o'clock. It is not the most expensive place in the city. It is simply a quiet one." Clara listened without interrupting. Alexander continued, "If you decide that my curiosity has turned into respect, you are welcome to join me." He paused briefly before finishing the thought. "And if you decide it has not, then you will never hear about the invitation again." The simplicity of the statement hung gently between them. No pressure, no expectation, just a choice. Clara looked at the card resting on the table, then back at Alexander. For a moment her expression softened in a way it had not before. Not surprise, not approval, something closer to recognition. "Patience," she said quietly. Alexander gave a small nod. "I am learning." He turned toward the door then, stepping away from the table without waiting for her answer. The night air outside the restaurant was cool and clean after the storm. As he walked down the sidewalk beneath the glow of the streetlights, Alexander Pierce realized something that had not occurred to him when the evening began. For the first time in many years, he was not certain what the outcome would be. And strangely enough, that uncertainty felt less like a risk and more like the beginning of something honest.